I'm very pleased now to introduce Mr. Marcel Acosta. He is the Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission in Washington, which is committed to preserving and enhancing the extraordinary qualities of Washington, D.C. and of the National Capital Region. Among his many current projects are the Southwest Eco District Initiative, a forward-looking approach to urban sustainability, and the Height of Buildings Master Plan, a study exploring strategic changes to the capital city's iconic skyline. He serves on the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority's Board of Directors, which also oversees the region's public transport system. Before joining the Commission, Mr. Acosta served as Senior Vice President of Planning and Development for the Chicago Transit Authority and Deputy Commissioner for the Chicago Department of Planning and Development. He holds a master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Wisconsin and was appointed a Loeb Fellow of Harvard's University Graduate School of Design. Please welcome him to address us on Washington, Symbol and City.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks so much, Annabelle, for the kind introduction. Also, thank you to the University of Canberra for inviting me to speak today. It's certainly a wonderful city. I don't necessarily mind the cloudy weather. It's very, very, very warm in Washington, D.C. right now. It's summertime, so this is a nice respite from that. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? So quite a few you have. You might know our very iconic skyline, as David Gordon mentioned or talked about today. Washington is a symbolic capital city. And essentially our capital and its skyline really expresses what's important to our nation. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also talk more about kind of the issues between the city and as a local institution as well as the federal presence there. And also how do we deal with both of those two issues in one place. You know, I think one of the incredible things about working in Washington, D.C. is really kind of the history and the importance of kind of the work that we do in terms of preserving what's important to our nation. And we add to that collection almost every day in terms of reflecting the values of our society, how we project ourselves to the nation and the international community. All of that is really wrapped up in planning for a capital city. Yeah, I think I did the wrong here. There we go. Also, I think capital cities are important places because it's as important gathering places for people in our country. That many events that are important to our history have occurred there. Everything from the women's suffrage movement to Martin Luther King's March on Washington. History's made in our capital cities because I think people gather there to communicate to their government, to talk to their government, to take stands about what's important. And unlike any other place, I think it has very significant meaning to people to be there. Also, I think we tend to, as David talked about, treat our front yard in a very important way, that we take great care in terms of protecting our skyline, making sure that our monuments are preeminent features of our city. And I think to a great extent that's what's memorable about Washington, D.C. It's really this very iconic, symbolic skyline that we have. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it did take a while to kind of get there in terms of becoming a place that was recognizable and important for many people. But before we talk about that, I do want to talk a little about the local city. We're a city about 630,000 people. Our metro area is about 5 million. So we are a small portion of a very large metropolitan area. It is a city of 100 distinct neighborhoods. Our population is growing right now. For many, many years, it has been on the decline, but I think people have rediscovered Washington, as they have with many American cities, as places to live, that they've become a very important place for people to come to. I think as opposed to, say, 10, 20 years ago, where suburbs or the outlying portions of the region were considered more fashionable. While we tend to think of Washington in terms of its front yard, it still has a number of problems, a number of issues that all American cities face. It also has its own local memory that we've seen many neighborhoods change over time. The example here is H Street, which is just a stone's throw away from the U.S. Capitol. In the 1960s, there were a series of riots which basically destroyed many portions of that neighborhood. It took many, many years to rebuild those portions of the city. And that's really kind of tied up into the collective memories of people who live there, that they do know these places, they've seen changes, they have their own lives, and so as they kind of work through these transformations of their community, I think it's very important to respect that in terms of planning for these areas. We're also a city of inequality, that I think we are a wealthy city, we're getting wealthier, but as you see from this map, there is a great divide in the city geographically. The areas in the red are some of our most wealthiest neighborhoods, and as you move forward to the east, they become poorer and poorer. Just around the Capitol 10 years ago were some of the most poorest neighborhoods in our city. So I think that's a fairly remarkable thing for a country so wealthy overall, that we can live in the midst of so much poverty in our capital city. We're also a city divided racially, that as you see from these dots, the red represents kind of where the Caucasian, the white populations live. The blue represents the places where the African American community lives. It's a city very divided still. It's slowly changing, but it does have a number of issues that we face locally. Everything from gentrification, pushing out the current community members who may live there, changes in neighborhoods, transformation. As the city becomes wealthier, there's a great concern by many people who lived there for many years that they may be pushed out. So those are some of the issues that we face as a city. While we're becoming a much more popular place to live, it does have consequences for the people who live there today. There's also the issue of disenfranchisement in our city. Many of you may not know that people who live in the District of Columbia do not have representation in Congress, that they do not elect a senator. We have a representative in the House that's non-voting. So given the great democracy, the great experiment in democracy of our country, the District of Columbia itself is not represented in our federal institutions. So that's quite the irony in our city. So there is a big pushback. There is this great desire for those who live there to assert their freedom as a city, to assert their rights to vote and rights to representation. So that's a big underlying element of controversy and a fundamental principle that kind of shapes all discussions from a local standpoint in terms of how they view the federal government, their relationships with the federal government. And it's only been since 1970 when they could actually elect a mayor. For almost 2 centuries, the city itself was controlled by commissioners that were appointed by the president. So it's kind of a very interesting history in terms of how our city came to be. I think one of the other issues too is that DC is always, you hear this about Canberra, but I think for many, many, many years, for centuries, DC has always been known as a very dull place. And it's taken a long, long time to kind of get it to the point where people see it as a real city. It took over 2 centuries to kind of get to that point, that people thought of it as a very sleepy southern town, that where bureaucrats go to, where people fled during the summer to go to other places, that it really wasn't a place to live. And it took a long, long time to get to the point where I think people had an aha moment where they thought that, oh, DC is a real city, that this is a place where I can live, where I would want to move to, not just because it's a seat of government, because it's becoming an interesting place to live. So today I'd like to talk about 3 things. This issue about local, federal, national conflicts through 3 lenses. One is the fight for the skyline, which Annabelle spoke about. We are doing a height of buildings master plan. I think a more fundamental issue with this height of buildings master plan is that today we have a symbolic skyline, but as the local community tries to assert itself, should that skyline change? Can other things be added to it? Can there be much more of a business focus? We talked a little bit about these metropolitan cities that are centers of commerce. That can we add to that And could that still be part of the national skyline? And how does that relate to the important monuments and the symbolic elements of our skyline today? So that's one set of issues that I want to talk about. Second issue is really about who controls the public realm. We have not only on the National Mall, but throughout the city, a number of memorials that are situated in parks. And so the question there is, how do these sacred spaces where we want to remember important events, important people, important things that are, that in many cases are solemn events, solemn things that you should treat. How do we deal with that in terms of a community that needs a local park? Can these things coexist? And the third piece of it that I want to talk about is really how can we work together, both from the national government and from the local government, to improve communities? That, to some extent, we have to look at ourselves as corporate citizens. That the federal government in Washington, D.C. is the largest corporate citizen of that community. So if you kind of flip it from kind of overseers of the city to how do we contribute to the health and well-being of the city, that kind of changes the dynamic. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing in that area. But first of all, the heights of building issue. So just to give you a little history lesson, I think David covered much of this in his lecture today, but really Washington was an intentionally planned city that did reflect many of the democratic ideals by placement of institutions. It really noted the separation of powers. That was really kind of an experiment in democracy. And this is represented in the form of the city and how the city was developed. That also took its cues from the past. Even though it was a new country and this was an experiment, it really tried to emulate many of the things that, if you look at this example, the Temple of Jupiter from the Roman Republic was kind of reflected of the People's House on the Hill, where our capital is still situated. That was on a high point in the city, and that to some extent it was intended to be the most important feature in the city skyline. As you approach the city, this is what you would see, this magnificent capital of the U.S. government. Charles Dickens also came to D.C. in 1842, and he called it the city of magnificent intentions. As you see here, many portions of it were not realized. That if you actually came to the city at that time, you would see cows grazing on the front lawn of the Washington Monument. You would see on the mall a canal instead of the wonderful formal features that you see today. You'd actually see a train station on the mall. This area in red is actually a train approaching a station in the mall that was removed at the beginning of the 20th century. But as you can see, there were a lot of things in transition that this place was not realized as was intended by the founders. And today we do have this iconic city, and that, as many pointed out, that Canberra has taken some of the cues in terms of the great placement of the National Mall, the places where memorials are lining this important space, the place where the public comes to gather for things like inaugurations and other special events. So over the last year, we've had discussions about the future, and that as the city is becoming much more diversified in terms of its economy, as the city is pretty much developed today, and as it has matured, and there may be more need for more space in terms of office, residential types of development, as the city has a desire to become a denser place, there is this question about whether we should allow the skyline to become higher, to allow taller buildings to come into the nation's capital. And just to give you some context, Congress had imposed a height of buildings law over the entire city about 100 years ago. And so you cannot build roughly up to 11 stories. So that's a very, modest building. What it has done was allowed a lot of development to occur in areas that may not have occurred, just because it allowed kind of this whole area to be developed out a lot more quickly. But I think there's a more fundamental issue here, is really who over who in this next century should be the key identity in terms of this city. Should it currently remain a federal symbolic landscape, one that's important to our nation? Or from the local community side, are there other things we could add to it? They point to London, for instance. Some of the other cities that are considered to be great cities have, very exciting skylines. And that to many people, the symbolic skyline of Washington doesn't necessarily cut it. It's distinctive, it's different, it's unique, it cannot be replicated anywhere else. But for many people, this debate goes on whether that's the appropriate thing for this third century. So we're now engaged in this whole process of discussion. Congress had asked my agency, the National Capital Planning Commission, to conduct this study, which is due at the end of this year. Essentially, we're taking input from a number of variety of sources, but I think it kind of breaks down into two basic camps. I mean, if you looked at it from the national standpoint, it is important for these, over generations, over the next couple of centuries, as long as our republic remains. It is essential, perhaps, that these important symbolic treasures, like the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome, those things should be the preeminent features in our skyline, and that we do have a responsibility to preserve that piece of our national place, our national city, our federal city. In the meantime, the city has its own goals. Like I mentioned, they want to become a much denser place. They want to become a more sustainable city. They want to encourage more economic vitality. They think the Heights and Buildings Act stifles that. And so we're running into that basic discussion right now. And so it'll be interesting to see. I can't predict necessarily where we're going to end up, but I think that's really kind of the interplay between what we aspire to as a nation and what we want to protect in terms of our legacy versus what the city needs in terms of its own future. So it really is playing out in this discussion about the city's urban form. Next up, I'd like to talk a little bit about our public realm. Again, it's a unique role of a capital, that this is a place where people come. It is a repository of our collective memory. It is a place where we remember important events and important people, and that both in the past but in the future. And that to some extent, we want to design spaces, through placemaking that would accommodate these deeds, not only in the past but in the future. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that was kind of interesting about the original L'Enfant plan of 1791 was that it had anticipated many of these memorials to be placed within the neighborhoods, at the intersection of these great diagonal streets, at these circles, at these squares, these places where there would be both community parks, local parks, but as well as these national memorials. So it's not only the National Mall where we have these many places of remembrance, but they are these very important places in our city, in our neighborhoods. Most of the park space in our city is actually owned by the federal government. So in the states, most of the local parkland is owned by the community, the city government. So these are essentially national parks in your community. So I think that's another source of tension between who owns these spaces, who owns our parks, what could they be used for, are these sacred spaces or not. In some cases they work well, and especially over at the turn of the 20th century, when many of these memorials were smaller, they were actually monuments in a park, that they weren't essentially overwhelming in scale. They didn't essentially take up the whole space. That there was a very comfortable relationship between the monument and the surrounding park. But these have grown over time. We've seen much more of these landscape monuments. This is kind of an exaggerated version. This is the World War II memorial in the National Mall. But we're finding proposals that would just overwhelm the scale of these parks. And these are not only being proposed on the National Mall, but in other locations throughout the city. I think one of the things that is interesting is that, what can you do in these spaces? This was something that a spokesperson from the National Park Service, which manages many of the monuments on the mall and throughout the city, said about wading and using the water in these spaces. It's inappropriate. You should not do it. It is sacred space. But if you live in these communities, wouldn't you want to do that? Wouldn't you want to go into a fountain? Wouldn't you want to have fun in a park? And in some instances, there have been debates whether children's tot lot fixtures, playground equipment, other things would be appropriate adjacent to these monuments because they are used, these parks have multiple purposes. In some cases, they do work well. The DuPont Circle is a great example. I think one of the things that is interesting about our memorials is that they lose meaning over time. At one point in time, Admiral DuPont, who was a hero during our Civil War, was quite a revered hero. But over time, that collective memory is lost. So people look at the fountain today, they don't necessarily know who it is, what it may represent. And I think that's been an issue for many of these monuments throughout the cities, that how do you deal with that sort of change in collective memory, that as generations go by, people tend not to remember. And so I think that's one of the other issues that we're dealing with in terms of how do we deal with changes in terms of people's thinking. What do we do how do we reinvigorate these spaces and the memory of that person? So I think that's kind of an interesting challenge for many of us. I think one of the other things, this is kind of a sidebar, but one of the other things that we're looking at is non-permanent memorials. The AIDS quilt is a great example of that, because the mall is of such symbolic value and of such symbolic importance, the mere fact that this was a temporary display didn't matter. The photographs, well, you could document it, people know what it is, it could be taken down, it could come back. And so we're looking at more uses of our spaces in those terms, that perhaps there are different ways to commemorate events, important individuals, important issues in a way that's different from permanence in our cities. So that's just one of the things we're exploring. We do have a project going on that is trying to do that. The final issue is our role in city development, that we are a major landowner in the city of Washington. Roughly 35% of the land in the city is owned by the federal government. That also includes major parks, but we do have a means to shape the future of our city. And so one of the things that we've done about 15 years ago was a plan called Extending the Legacy. And one of the things that it dealt with was, what it had proposed was to focus on recentering federal development, not in one quadrant of the city where the National Mall is, but try to spread that development throughout the other three quadrants of the city. So essentially, they would be used to anchor neighborhood revitalization. We would use federal headquarters buildings to do that. And we would make investments in these communities. A lot of times it's easier for the government to come in and be kind of the risk taker in this situation. There's a lot of private development, a lot of private businesses do not want to go in where they don't necessarily see the community's full potential yet. And so to some extent, the federal government could take that risk and help regenerate communities. So I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that's an interesting notion in terms of how we can become good corporate citizens in our city. This is an area called the southeast district of the city. This is what you would see today. We have a new baseball stadium that opened up just a few years ago. If you went there today, you would see a revitalized Riverwalk. This lines the Anacostia River, which was mostly industrial for many, many years. You would see rejuvenated warehouses. This is one of the few areas where we had the building type, industrial building type, to turn into residential. You'd also see new residential and office development going in. It's a thriving area right now. But if you went there, say, 10 years ago, it was not. It was a pretty forlorn place. Again, when I showed you the map of the city, this was one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city demographically. That was mostly an industrial complex. So what we did was we owned a huge chunk of land there that we basically surplused. And we gave it to the district, and we not necessarily gave it to the district, but we put it out for private development that would encourage a more mixed-use type of development there, that we had, in fact, used our assets in order to help promote economic vitality in the district. So this is what you would see today on the same block, that by selling off that land, it did allow for private development to occur in the area. This is just a bird's eye view of this area. But again, it's quite a wonderful place now that it has a great riverfront park. It is one of the places to be in Washington, D.C. One of the things that we also did, though, we did not abandon the entire area. That we did put a major cabinet-level headquarters there, the U.S. Department of Transportation building in this area. It was the first to go into this complex. It did move many, many federal employees in the area to begin the repopulation of it in terms of just a workforce. And many other businesses came in after that complex opened. In the meantime, we coordinated our efforts with the city. Not only did they want the condominium development and the new residential development that occurred, but right adjacent to it was a low-income housing development. So they basically went into that area, revitalized it. There was a replacement program which allowed for people to stay in this neighborhood, which was a very important part of it. That, as I mentioned earlier, gentrification was a big fear in many people, but they had worked through the program to allow a rebuilding in this area. It became denser, which allowed more people to come in, but it allowed people to stay through a number of programs that they had put in as part of this program. So I do think it is a very successful development. And this is the last thing I wanted to talk about. This is the area between the National Mall and the waterfront. Annabelle had mentioned the Southwest Eco District. This is another area that was predominantly a federal enclave. It was a very boring area of just federal office buildings. And one of the things that we share with the district is that we want to turn these into more mixed-use areas of the city. That we also, through President Obama's executive order, also wanted to encourage sustainability at a district scale. So there are a number of things that we're doing. I don't have enough time to talk through it. That are innovative in terms of waste, energy use in this area by sharing components, by sharing utilities that we are trying to reduce our carbon footprint of this complex, and also turning this into a more desirable neighborhood that people would want to live in today. So we do have some information on our website if you're interested in talking about that or reading more about that. So in closing, I just want to say a few things about your city. We're about 100 years ahead of you in terms of our development. That it took a long time to kind of get to the place that we are today. That it does take a lot of work. There were a lot of people who basically took what was a swamp, turned it into something wonderful and magical as a place. And that now we're entering our third act. That it was the founders had a vision, it was executed, and I think the issue for us today is what will it take to become a real city? That we cannot just look at ourselves as just a capital for the health of the people who live there today and in the future, and that to a great extent, while the federal government is always going to have an important presence there and a very symbolic presence. In this community, I think one of the big changes that we had made kind of from our own mindset is that we had to work together with the local government in order to see these things through, to make these very fundamental changes to our city, to become a better corporate citizen in Washington, D.C. So I think it's one of the things that will take place in your own evolution, that as you look at making Canberra a more livable place, a more wonderful place, a place where people would desire to live in, a place, that's very unique within all Australian cities, that, you're doing the work today that lays the foundation for the future. So I do think of great potential of this city, and that there are a lot of great things that will occur over this next century right here in Canberra. So thank you very much.